Beads are the oldest spiritual practice in the whole world. They've found beads in Morocco that are 150,000 years old. Making a bead is really hard work. Why would you do this? And why would you do this particularly when life was hard? Why would you want to make a bead? Find a bead and roll it between your thumb and your forefinger and see how it makes you feel.
It's soothing.
Because that's our first gesture as a baby. We're born, we're put to our mother's breast, and that's the gesture we make with our mother's nipple for her milk to let down and to feed us. And so our ancestors were remembering the feeling of they needing their mother and wanting that feeling of comfort in their bodies, that like, oh, if I'm in my mother's arms, I'm going to be okay.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Ask Julie Ryan Show. It's where we blend spirituality and practicality to help you live a life of purpose and joy. We have my dear friend Perdita Finn with us on the show today. You guys are going to love her. I'm excited for you to hear part 2, where Perdita and I talk about the hidden history of women healers being burned as witches throughout Europe and the Americas. And then Perdita shares how praying to ancestors can help us create miracles in our own lives. Please remember to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this episode with your family and friends. Now, let's go chat with Perdita. I think these sacred sites, certainly all of the ancient civilizations, they've seen them. They're everywhere all over the world. And so my next question is, did they originate in some instances from beings outside of the earth?
Oh, that's, this is above my pay grade, Julie. I don't know.
But it's coming into my zeitgeist.
I know it's a big topic right now. Like, we are stardust, right? Stardust is part of what we are.
That's what the song says.
I know, right? And I mean, sometimes I think it's like, those Russian nesting dolls. I love Russian nesting dolls. But they're really wise, right? I don't know. I'm sure you know this, but we all began in our grandmother's bodies. When our mother was formed in our grandmother's body, we were eggs inside our mother's body. So we were Russian nesting dolls, right? We were already inside our grandmother's body. And I sometimes think, oh, the earth is held in the body of a bigger mother, right? Who's bigger than this, who's the cosmos. And,
interesting analogy. Yeah.
Sometimes I think, my favorite painting of all time, actually it's mentioned in the Da Vinci Code, but it's by Da Vinci, and it shows Mary, Madonna, but she's sitting in the lap of her mother, who's like a great mountain, and it's Saint Anne. In Catholic folklore, Anne is the mother of Mary. Right? And she's like a mountain. And Mary is sitting very playfully on her mother's lap. And of course, then sitting in her lap is the child. And then the child is reaching up to wrap an arm around Anne. And it's like this beautiful circle of life.
What's the painting called?
It's called Saint Anne and Mary. I think, or the
it's
Virgin and her mother. I forget the official name. It's at the Louvre. I've seen it. There are very many different versions of it. It's so beautiful. But Saint Anne was also an old grandmother goddess. Anu in the Irish, she was the sea. And, Saint Anne goes all the way back in Celtic folklore. And so, she a mashup of, but, Mary also has to have a mother, doesn't she? Everybody needs a mother.
Yeah. Yeah. Every paramecium, every whatever. Yeah.
But then, it's mothers all the way. But then I think there's, that child reaching up to hold the mother too, right? There's something really sacred about that in that circle.
One of my favorite books, The Way of the Rose. I have about 7 books on my desk that are up there all the time. This is one of them, The Way of the Rose. Tell us about what inspired you to write this? Give us the you're one of the best storytellers on the planet as far as I'm concerned. And and so tell us what really led you and Clark to write this book and to form the Way of the Rose Fellowship, I
It was
guess, is
very selfish. Okay, so here I am, raised nothing, ex-Buddhist, ex-Episcopalian, and I became devoted to the rosary. And I loved the rosary, and I kept imagining, like, I wish I could find other people who wanted to pray the rosary with me and didn't feel like you had to be Catholic. I love it. It's like my favorite prayer. It's just made it comforts me. I would pray it with my children. I just love it. You just love it. If you pray the rosary, you know it. It's just a great thing to do, right?
I
Uh,
pray it every night when I go to bed.
yeah, it's the best sleep aid in the
But I
whole world.
use my 10 fingers because here's why. I have my grandmother's rosaries, I have my mother's rosary, my first communion rosary came from Fatima, my great aunt gave it to me, but here's why I do it on my fingers, and I think that's why they came up with 10 Hail Marys and all that, because I think I'm gonna fall asleep, and the crucifix is gonna I'm gonna sleep on it, and it's gonna leave an imprint of the crucifix in my cheek, and it's gonna be like a stigmata, and I'm gonna have this imprint of the crucifix. So I think, well, if I just use my fingers, then if I fall asleep before I finish it, I don't have to worry about it. And and my priest, Father Fallon, always says, if you don't finish the rosary, it's fine because the angels finish it for
That's
you.
right. I never finished the rosary. It's one of the greatest sleep aids in the whole world. I
I
go to
know.
sleep saying it. Sometimes Clark and I will say, "I think I'm gonna take a rosary nap." Which means I start praying the rosary, then I go off.
Well, it's just because it's an ancient form of meditation with the beads and
But
the
but it really calms you.
yeah. Yeah.
It really
Why?
well, there I can here's an example. Beads are the oldest spiritual practice in the whole world. They found beads in Morocco that are 150,000 years old. And that's beads made of stone and shell. Beads made of clay or beads made of things that, leather or things that would disappear, we don't even have evidence of. But what making a bead is really hard work. If to take a piece of stone and get a little hole through it is really hard. Why would you do this? And why would you do this particularly when life was hard? Why would you want to make a bead? And what I always say to people is if you're wearing some jewelry or you have a button on your shirt or you've got a necklace, find a bead and roll it between your thumb and your forefinger and see how it makes you feel.
It's soothing.
Do you know why? Because that's our first gesture as a baby. We're born, we're put to our mother's breast, and that's the gesture we make with our mother's nipple for her milk to let down and to feed us. And what happens when a baby begins to nurse is that the mother experiences the same hormone as the baby does, flooding their bodies. And it's a hormone called prolactin. And it makes the mother flood with peace, to be still. It makes the baby flood with peace. It's the same hormone that lets down and allows birds to sit on their eggs and be still. And when we make that gesture with a bead, they have done studies that hormone lets down in our bodies. And so our ancestors were remembering the feeling of they needing their mother and wanting that feeling of comfort in their bodies. All will be, what is it, Julian of Norwich says, all will be well and all manner of things shall be well. That like, oh, if I'm in my mother's arms, I'm going to be okay. I was really sick this past winter and I was in the hospital and I was too sick to pray. But I wasn't, I had 104 fever for 10 days and I was septic but I wasn't too sick to hold on. And I just held on to the beads. And my family and my friends said the prayers for me. And that's what so sometimes when I say to people in the beginning is just get a string of beads, hold on to them and see how it makes you feel.
So you think I should use an actual rosary at
No, here's
night?
the thing. I do use my fingers all the time. I used to use my fingers on the subway in New York because I didn't wanna embarrass myself praying the rosary in public. Now I embarrass myself all the time, and I
Yeah.
want people to ask me about my rosaries.
Yeah. All right. I love it. And you're you're the one who brought the rosary, you and Clark, into the modern world, in my opinion, with no expectations of you gotta be Catholic, you gotta be devout, you opened it up to everybody.
Mm.
And how many people do you have in your fellowship now, like from nothing that you've
Uh,
put together?
well, here's the thing. I was praying the rosary. I never thought Clark would pray the rosary with me. Then Our Lady started showing up and talking to him and said, if you rise to pray the rosary, it might be interesting.
Right.
And so Clark, it's what the first rosary miracle that we experienced after Our Lady showed up was we were praying the rosary together. And then how could we explain to people how an ex-Buddhist monk, my husband used to be a Buddhist teacher until he exposed all the sexual and financial crimes of all the Buddhist teachers. How how could two people who we're not Catholic and what right do we have to pray the rosary? How do we can invite other people to pray the rosary? And so Clark, in this kind of naive, cheerful way that he has, went on Facebook and said, "Anyone want to pray the rosary and be devoted to," what he said, "ecology, not theology, to be devoted to the earth and to let it and you get to call the lady whatever name you want to call her." And people started showing up. Julie, people have showed up from all over the world. Sometimes at our rosary shakers, we have people calling in from Russia, from South Africa, from Saudi Arabia, of course, from America and Europe and Australia and New Zealand. But people love their mother and they've been called to her. And a lot of people feel like they don't have a right to pray the rosary because they're not Catholic. And, Our Lady has said in a number of her modern apparitions that hard times are coming. Pray the rosary, even if you're not Catholic. Just pray the rosary.
And so you have tens of thousands of people
Yeah,
from around the world. I
yeah.
mean, last time I looked, it was like 40,000 people or something.
And then we have the email list, that's just on Facebook.
So it's even bigger
Yeah, I guess,
than that.
yeah, and
I know.
and and, you know, and Clark and I just wanted to have rosary friends.
I know. I joined you on New Year's Eve and brought a couple of best friends
I know, it's just so
that
nice.
one year.
It's
Yeah.
nice to have rosary friends, and the other we do on June 16th of every year, we have a big party, and people come from all over the world to celebrate Our Lady of Woodstock, and we all pray the rosary together. We do it online and in person.
Yeah, I know you do. All right, let's change directions for a little bit. You're the first person who told me this was just this huge revelation to me that it was women healers who were burned at the stake as witches. And I remember when you told me that, and I remember saying, "What?" And you said, "Oh, yeah." And they were burned by some of the most well-educated, wealthy men in Europe and America. So I want you to that was such a huge revelation to me. Maybe I live under a rock or something, but that was the first
It's a
time
revelation for
I
me
ever heard that.
too.
Yeah,
It's one of the things that's really amazing to me, Julie, is how few books there are about what happened under what we call, the witch times. And there's a lot of mythology and wrong-headed facts about the times. It didn't happen in some superstitious dark age. It actually happened from the 1500s through the 1700s. It was really what we call the modern world, the time of the printing press and education and the Enlightenment, um, that gave birth to this violence against women, against the land, and against the old folk practices. I talked about those Madonna statues being burned in Europe, and a lot of them were burned in the Reformation, but actual women were also burned on both sides. And,
Which followed the Inquisition, right? Where it was kinda that was the
yeah.
first purging,
Yeah, the
at
Inquisition was
least.
you're getting ready, right? You're getting ready. I mean, it's really it's so awful. There's a marvelous book I recommend. It's called Witch Craze by a scholar. Her name is Anne Barstow. It's very readable. She says in the beginning, she was, a professor, a college professor. And she said, I want these women to have names. I want them to have stories. And I want to document. There were villages in Germany where after the inquisitors came through, not a single woman was left alive.
Wow.
And
What were they so afraid of?
what do you know what the crime was that they Julie, and I'm looking at you, and I'm wrapping an arm around you 'cause you got talking to the dead.
Yeah.
That was the thing, they wanted to stop that.
So did that come from the church? Did it come from academia? Was it a combo platter? Who was
Yeah, I
behind
think it
all
was
of
a
that?
combo platter. It's so interesting to me. There's a wonderful thinker, he was a neuroscientist, and he noticed, that innovations and I never can keep left and right brain straight because I'm probably the other kind of brain you're supposed to be. I never know which is which. But he noticed that there were certain innovations in the world that made us more analytical. For instance, phonetic spelling, and then the printing press, and then the internet. And after the invention of each of these new mediums of abstraction, he calls them, people become much more violent against the feminine. It's a book he wrote, his name was Leonard Shlain, it's a book called The Alphabet versus the Goddess, and it's kind of a revelation, and what he says is what happens, when the printing press is invented in Europe, prior to the printing press, most people were illiterate. Your village priest, he'd never read the Bible. He was illiterate. I read a wonderful book about pre-literate Europe, and it described this, bishop coming into a town, and he asked somebody, he said, "Do you know who Jesus is?" And he says, "Oh, I know that bloke. He's the guy who hangs upside down from the tree every spring so his blood can renew the earth." And it's the story of Odin. I mean, people just had folklore.
Mhm.
And then Gutenberg invents the printing press, and what gets printed is the Bible, and everybody can some people can read and are reading the Bible, but the second most published book after the Bible was a book called the Malleus Maleficarum, and it's a book about finding out witches and hunting them down and torturing them and killing them.
Wow.
And that's it unleashes and
Even today, it's the second
well, no, it was in the
but back
1400s.
then,
The late 1400s, it was a bestseller. Um,
I was gonna say.
Not now. But what he says is what's really interesting is he says you get these innovations, these technological innovations, and they abstract us from the real world, and they make us more violent. And so he would just say that, like, the internet, we see this in social media. People have lost I keep wanting to teach people manners again, like, you don't have to have an opinion about everything. You don't have to shoot your mouth off about everything, Be nice, right? But people get more violent and inflamed with each other, and we forget how to talk to each other and be together.
So, why Europe and America? Or did it happen in more places and I'm
Well,
just
it does
unaware
happen.
of it?
He does chart that it happens in other places, and there's I think
Why the Western world?
you're gonna love my next book, Julie. Can I send it to you for an
Yeah,
endorsement?
yeah, yeah.
I know.
Well, we'll
'Cause this
have
is
you
what
back
it's
on and
about.
you can
It's
talk
about the
about it.
mother. So what happens, here's what happens, and it's a really big change. We used to be hunter-gatherers, and that meant that we walked around and we ate whatever was available, and we were like the geese and the deer, and we followed the herds, and we followed the seasons, and we went where the food was, and we walked. We walked a lot. People only worked for about 2 hours a day in hunter-gatherer culture. It was not hard. You could put your hand in a stream and pull out a salmon the size of your head, It wasn't you and hunter-gatherers ate a significantly more varied diet than we eat. They ate a better diet than we ate, and they lived longer. Now, more children died. That's true, right? But they weren't plagued by disease. Then a really interesting thing happens. Why it happens, we could talk about that for a whole show. But at a certain point, 10,000 years ago, we begin to stop being hunter-gatherers. And we start noticing that grains crop up and grow. We start reseeding grains. One of the theories is that the first reason we started to farm was not to grow bread, but to make beer. That literally we got drunk. And it's really interesting. This happens all over the world. The 4 major grains, rice, barley, corn, and wheat, all create civilization, city-states. What happens is, instead of walking across the land, instead of being part of the seasons and sort of living in this very maternal embrace of seasonal return, we start owning things. We start owning the land. And from the very beginning of civilization, it's only benefited the 1%. It's about wealth, hoarding wealth. And in order, agriculture is backbreaking work. My son is a farmer, so I know of what I speak. He's out buying a special belt for his back right now because it's backbreaking work. But it gives you the illusion, some people, that we're not going to have to go hungry, right? But in fact, when agriculture begins, most people end up being malnourished. They're only getting bread, right? They're not eating a varied diet anymore. The land gets exhausted. And how do you convince people to be your farmers? Well, you give them a beer at the end of the day, and you also enslave them. And then you also have to go get more land because the land gets destroyed. It gets too tired. So you have to go conquer another country and get another land. That's what Europe was about. We had to come to America to get more land, right? And so civilization breeds a lot of violence. And I always think that Jesus was trying to teach us how to be hunter-gatherers again. He says, consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. He was traveling around with his followers, trusting that the earth would feed them. And that's a really radical way of living. I mean, we can't live that way anymore. The earth we don't live on the same planet, right? Everything, the forests are gone. Everything has been changed. But that civilization creates a lot of violence. Civilization is dependent upon slavery and misogyny. And the other thing that happens in civilization is these indigenous cultures and these hunter-gatherer cultures, they're not matriarchies so much as they're mother-centered. Does that make sense? Grandmother-centered, mother-centered. And then what happens is, just as the land has to produce food, women have to produce children to work in the fields. They're baby producers. And then the men want to own the land. You own the land and you only want to give it to your sons. So you have to, you have to own your women who will produce your children who will inherit your land. So all of this misogyny and violence comes, in Jesus's day, 2,000 years ago, it was still possible to imagine returning to that hunter-gatherer lifestyle. I think his world, you could still imagine it, leaving empire behind, leaving the Roman Empire behind, trusting the fish, right? He really, he said, look, we're gonna figure out how to eat. We're gonna figure out how to do this again. What's so interesting to me is in the New World, in America, often women would run away to live with the indigenous peoples, and they never wanted to go back to the Puritans. They never did. There are all these stories about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And the whole primogeniture thing is a really good point too, because women couldn't inherit things. I think Queen
Exactly.
Elizabeth changed that before she died so that Princess Charlotte could assume the crown if need be, and they wouldn't pass her over for her little brother. But God, how many eons has that been in place? Back to the women healers. So, what was the whole point of burning those healers at the stake? Was it because of the advent of the new, more modern medicine model, or?
Yeah, it's disempowering women, and, we see this a lot, the midwives were the men took over the birthing of babies and, decommissioned the midwives, and, I mean, a lot of it was this gets into some really complicated territory, but it was also wanting to control birth. And, midwives had other lore too. They knew how to tell women how not to get pregnant. They knew how to tell them, there's really, they knew how to tell them how to stop a pregnancy. And this was lore that women needed, right? They needed that. And it was very, and but men wanted to control women's bodies. They wanted to control the land and they wanted to control women's bodies.
And they wanted their women to continue to produce because babies didn't survive, so they needed the work hands basically on the
Exactly, you
farm.
needed work hands, and you needed and it was, it was forced it was forced labor. You had to produce children to work in the fields, and, um, so it's complicated stuff, and, we've seen such a return of the midwifery movement. I have a number of friends who are midwives who've become in, and, um because we've forgotten that some of these things can happen. There's a lot of lost my favorite television show, my most spiritual television show is called The Midwife. Have you ever watched it on
I
PBS?
haven't, but I've heard of it.
Oh, Julie, if you need, like, something to bring your blood pressure down, it's about a group of young women. It's when national healthcare gets, instituted in England after World War II, and so they commission all these young women to be midwives who go into poor communities to be the midwives. But they're not just midwives, they're social workers, and they're doctors, and they're therapists, and they live with a group of nuns in this poor community. It's based on a true story, a memoir, and it's all about these old women nuns who are midwives and these young women coming together to care for this community. And it's just the most moving spiritual story, and it makes me wish that every community had such a house that had a community of women who was caring for people like that.
But I think that we've been taught, though, that you don't wanna deliver at home. You wanna be in the hospital because if there's an emergency or something, you gotta be there and.
I I'm actually pro hospital that way. I have a daughter who, has a lot of health conditions, and, she'll have to give birth in a hospital. Do you know what I mean? Like, and, you gotta remember women died too. And, but some women can give birth at home and some need to run to the hospital, but we can
Well,
also.
and there's more, I think, of an incidence where there are midwives and birth doulas that are in the hospital
Yes,
coaching them.
that's what I had.
Yeah. So, well, you were progressive. You were
I
way
also
ahead of
had
the curve.
can I tell you a secret? I did it my second child, I had a midwife, but my first child, the insurance would only cover this old OBGYN. He was a guy. He was the best. I loved You know what I mean? Like, so I'm always telling young women, you don't need an Instagram-worthy birth plan. You just need a good, experienced guide. And it
Yeah.
doesn't matter if it's an old he was an old Park Avenue OBGYN, and he was the best.
Oh, I had Jonathan without any drugs because he came really fast. I remember saying to my OB at the time, I don't wanna do this anymore.
I know that feeling.
And she said, "Yeah, well, the train's kind of already left the station." And then I said, "I know, bazillions of women have done this and survived. I can too." But I vividly remember saying, "I don't wanna do this anymore."
Well, you know
And
what
I
would be
was
the
in the
worst?
middle of labor.
My Irish grandmother, to come full circle, you know what she said when she went into labor with her first child? She turned to the doctor and says, "And how does it come out?" She thought her stomach was gonna open up. She
Oh,
had
jeez.
Can you
Oh,
imagine?
jeez. one more question about the burning of the witches, because this just still blows my mind. You said that it was some of the most well-educated, wealthiest men that were behind all of this, and they were
Yes, it was.
kinda basically stirring up the frenzy and all of that.
You find the worst violence in the places with the most educated men, and you find the least violence where there is the least education. So, in Germany and Scotland and England and in northern France, you find the worst violence. In Germany, the worst. And and, um and it's among, scholars and academics and PhD students. We see this again in, people talk about Salem a lot. They think that was, by the way, that was not the only witch trial in America. There were lots. There were 14 women hung in Hartford, Connecticut years
Really?
before.
But that was long after the when it was happening in Europe, wasn't it?
No, it was still going on plenty wild in Europe, plenty
Oh,
wild.
it was.
It
Okay, and
was,
so
absolutely.
it came over to America
Yeah, it
during
really came over, and there's been no single documentation of all of the witch violence in the Americas, and it's really interesting, there was so much of it, and I've known a few people who've gone around and begun to collect this information, and it's pretty astounding. The first woman killed in the America was in 1635, like a few years after the Puritans. Her name was Alice Young. There was a flu epidemic in Connecticut, and the minister's children died, and Alice nursed her children through it successfully, and she was accused as a witch, of being a witch,
Wow,
and killed.
craziness.
Crazy, right? And it's just, but so anyway, in Salem, we make children teenagers read The Crucible, right? Written by, um, you know, uh I can't think of his name right now. I'm married to Marilyn Monroe. We will remember Marilyn Monroe and not his name. Um, but it pretends as if it's about a bunch of girls being hysterical and getting everybody killed, and that's not what happened. What happened is a group of Harvard intellectuals came up to Salem and got a lot of women killed, and they're the ones who set up the courts and built the gallows.
And we don't know why, though.
They wanted to suppress folk practices in the New World. You see they wanted to suppress, and what you see is that and you also see this happening with the indigenous community and the enslaved African community. They're bringing their indigenous wisdom to the New World, right? And 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 it's being suppressed with tremendous violence. And women are being taught, you only have to kill a couple of women to frighten a lot of women.
Right.
And 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 so you're not gonna be talking to your dead grandmother. You're not going to be, you know, cooking up magic. You're not you're gonna be very frightened. You're gonna I think about I write in the new book I just finished writing. I had an ancestor, she came over at 15 by herself to Boston, right after the Pilgrims. I don't know why she came by herself. Except she left an area that was 5 miles from a place called Pendle Hill where 15 women were hung just a few years ago before she came. So she must have been horrified, right? Must have been terrifying.
Mhm.
And she comes to this country, and she gets to Boston, and I don't know why, again, but she goes down to join Roger Williams in Rhode Island because she wants to leave the Puritans behind. They're too scary.
Mhm.
And then she's very close to Connecticut where Alice Young is killed. It's right there. It's all happening all around her. And I think of her, this ancestress of mine, and what's she gonna tell her daughters? Behave yourself. Be a good girl. Don't act up. Don't you be different. You dress like everybody else. You talk like everybody else. Do you know what I mean? Don't you do anything weird.
'Cause it can cost you your life.
It costs you your life. And then it creates, my wasp grandmothers. You know?
Well, and the other thing that's coming into my head too, Perdita, that I think that's really fascinating is they couldn't talk to their dead grandmothers, but it was okay to pray to the saints and the angels and Jesus and whoever.
You couldn't pray to the saints if you were Puritan. I mean, if you were Protestant. The saints got eliminated and Mary got eliminated. Protestantism, let's call it what it is. It's an attempt to get rid of Mary and the saints.
Hmm. I never thought of it that way.
It's really simple. And it's really just an attempt to get rid of all of the folk practices and consolidate power in the men.
Huh. Interesting. That's another show.
And the real thing that happens with the Reformation is the getting rid of the idols, right? The getting rid of the statuary. We talked about these statues that are so powerful.
Mhm.
And, people were devoted to them. They were more devoted to them often than they were the priests.
Well, back to Jonathan, he's gonna be mortified I've mentioned him so much in this episode. But when he was in kindergarten, of course, he was in a Catholic school, and it was May crowning. Well, I did May crowning as a kid. I mean, I knew what it was. You sing songs to the Virgin Mary, and you bring flowers, and you lay it at the statue. So my husband's there, Jonathan's in kindergarten, he's got this beautiful bouquet of peonies out of my garden that I wrapped with a ribbon, and he's all dolled up and ready to go, and so the little kids are processing in, and they're singing these songs to Mary and leaving flowers, and my husband turned to me and he said, "And you wonder why people call this a cult?"
Well,
And I
here's the thing.
said, "Well,
What you're describing, that May Day celebration,
yeah,
is
it's
the
ancient."
the oldest spiritual tradition in the world.
Yeah. Precedes Christianity by what?
Precedes precedes everything. Roses, offering flowers to the mother in springtime is probably the oldest spiritual practice there is. Just and there it is, and think about the joy. Children love it. We do at our feast day celebration, we make flower crowns, and the kids love to make flower crowns, and then they love to go crown the lady, and then they crown themselves, and they crown their to be crowned with flowers. We've worn a crown of thorns for a long time, right?
Right. Yeah,
We need the crowns of flowers back.
yeah. But it was interesting because I was looking at it from his perspective of not having been exposed to it before and from a male point of view, and I thought, "I understand what he's saying.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I get it." And at the same time, I didn't think anything of it because 'cause I'd been raised with it, and then when I did some research on it, I learned what you just mentioned, that it's just ancient, way precedes Christianity. Way, way, way. So, couple more questions as we're winding down. I could talk to you all day, as you know. Why do we pray to spiritual beings like angels and saints and Jesus and the Mother Mary and loved ones in spirit instead of going right to God, the source?
For me, I was gonna say intimacy. Intimacy. At Christmas when everybody gives you different presents and you receive a different present from people and it's a real treasure. Like I found the apple butter in my cabinet that my nephew, my beloved sweet nephew, made and brought to me at Christmas, and we finally had it this morning on our muffins this morning. It was so good. And it was just that connection of intimacy that he had brought this gift to me. And I think that we we live in a time when more helpers are better, not less, right? But we also I pray to all kinds of saints. Okay, I pray to everybody. I'm an equal opportunity. Julie, I don't like to leave anybody out. I you know, teach me a saint and I'll pray to them. And I mean it. I begin my morning with so many prayers to so many different beings and saints and angels and they all have different gifts. And they all arrive like the Magi with different gifts. And we get to know each other. I like having friends on the other side. Just like we found a way of the rose to have friends to pray the rosary, I pray to all these saints. So once we were about to have guests for the weekend, and our toilet broke. It's a crisis. And in Woodstock, getting a plumber on the weekend is impossible. impossible. We're a tourist town. It's impossible. I said, there must be a patron saint of plumbing. There must be. So I get on Google. Who's the patron? The patron saint of plumbing is a guy called Saint Vinny Ferrer.
Of course it
Vinny
is.
Ferrer from the 12th century. He died in a sewer. Okay, so Vinny Ferrer is the patron saint of plumbing. Go, Vinny, you get me a plumber, and I will never forget you. I have his picture on the altar because I put a call out on Facebook, and somebody told me about their cousin who I think had just got out of jail, who used to be a plumber, and he came right over. He wanted cash. He fixed the toilet, and everything was fine. And I love Vinny, and I always tell people about Vinny, and I know so many people now who call on him. I I I talk to all the dead. I talk to the saints. I also have secular saints. Elvis, I bet you Elvis my kids have a genetic condition that makes their lives very complicated called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and Elvis probably died of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and so I pray to Elvis every morning. I wrote him a little prayer, "Love me tender, love me sweet, help my kids get on their feet, for it's 1 for the body and 2 for the soul, 3 to get healthy, go, get, go." Every morning, Elvis and I check in about my kids and their Ehlers-Danlos. I pray to everybody. I pray to my grandmothers. I pray, you've told me about Pope Clement, so I pray to Pope Clement. You introduced me to him, and we've gotten to know each other, and I love having friends on the other side.
Yeah.
Don't you?
I do, and here's my take, and I'd love your opinion about this. My take is we're all a fractal of the divine, and
Yes.
it's God speaking, source speaking through all of these different fractals because it gives us a better human frame of reference in order to connect instead of, for me, the thought of speaking to God himself, sounds like James Earl Jones or Morgan Freeman or somebody in an extra deep voice. I think, and I realize that it's all source, it's all coming from the divine working through, just like when I'm working with people. It's spirit communicating through me and with me
Yeah.
to help heal people, to help communicate with people, whatever. And so that's my take on it. But you are the master of all the queens of you. I tell people about you all the time, and I say,
Truly,
"My friend Perdita."
and I tell you people about you all the time because, you have the most important piece of information of all, and I wanna just talk about that, which is the reason I talk about you all the time, is you said people are gonna die when their mothers show up, and you talked about the importance of the mother.
She runs the show.
She runs the show,
Yeah.
and we need to be in relationship to our mothers on the other side, and I tell people, get your house in order before that moment. I sometimes go like, I was really, really thank goodness I didn't see my mother when I was really sick this winter, right? But at one point I thought, well, if the other side is I would have seen my mother, and I love her.
Well, I tell people about you because I say, "My friend Perdita has a checklist before she gets out of bed every morning." And she's like, "Okay, mom, I need you to do this. Dad, I need you to do that. Grandma, I need you to do this. St. Anthony, I've lost my necklace. Can you find it for me?" And
Oh, St. Anthony is very busy in our household.
you have this list of things that you ask for in your prayers before you get out of bed in the morning. And you tell me they all come true. Yeah. So how do people do that?
I say start simple. Ask one person on the other side for one specific thing. It could be a parking space. It could be a human being on the other end of the phone. It could be a money issue. It could be something, but make it practical and tangible. So if you pray for world peace, you don't know if you're going to get your answer or not in this lifetime, right? So make it practical and let your necessity. So I'll tell you a story. I knew a woman who I gave this advice to her. And she lives in a place where there was a terrible drought, and she just planted these trees, and her trees were dying, and she was told she had to mulch them with wood chips to keep them alive after she watered them during this terrible drought. But everybody got the same advice, and none of the nurseries had wood chips. They were all sold out. And she couldn't find wood chips anywhere. And she said, so she had an uncle who had been like in construction or something. And she said, and he used to bring her dines for candy bars when she was a little girl. And she said, Uncle, get me some wood chips. And then she said, I better find a photo of him. So she went and looked through her albums. She found a photo of him, and she's just putting it on her bookcase when she hears the noise of a truck backing up outside. And she runs outside, and her next door neighbor is having a truckload of wood chips delivered. And she says, can you deliver me some wood chips? And he says, yeah, this guy only bought half a truck. You want the other half?
Wow.
That fast. And then she came and she was really shaken. She was scared. She was kind of freaked out. And she said, this is real, right? And I said, this is real. Your uncle loves you. And she said, well, now I'm going to ask him to help me find a husband.
So did she find a husband?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. Sometimes you need a big team. I got a team on my daughter. I don't know. We're working on it. So,
Got a matchmaker team.
Start small. Start small. Start tangible. Start small. And I tell a story in my newest book about we had this couch. It was an old couch, and one Thanksgiving, my niece sat on it and her butt went right down to the floor, and that was it. It was over. And we just didn't have money for a new couch. And my aspirations for couch and our financial resources were not meeting up. So I thought, okay, we'll go to we'll look at Goodwill, we'll look at the Habitat for Humanity Restore, we'll look at, we'll check the want ads. And I discovered that there are the ugliest couches in the world out there, Julie. You know what I mean? And it got so bad. Like, I was like, oh my God, I wish I could win the lottery so I could buy that slip-covered Pottery Barn couch I'm dreaming of, in velvet. And through this whole process, my daughter had to go to the doctor in this town, in the next town over. And she kept asking for me to take her to this junk shop, and because she loves to buy clothes. And she has too many clothes. And the junk shop was out of our way, and it was across the highway, and you had to make a left turn across traffic, which I hate. And we were always in a hurry to go to the doctor, and I always said no. And one day she got so angry at me. She said, I've been with you to look for so many couches, and you won't take me to buy jeans. Can we just go to the junk shop to look for jeans? I said, all right. And as we pull into the junk shop, a truck is coming in, and in the back of the truck is a brand new velvet Pottery Barn couch.
Wow.
And I said to the guys, is that for sale? They said, well, we're going to just donate it. But if you want us to donate it to you, we'll donate it to you. And they drove it over to my house.
So who did you pray for that?
That was my mother. I asked
Your
my
mother.
mother. I'm sorry. And
your mother was a fashionista, so
she was
she
a
would enjoy
fashionista,
the
and she had a
velvet
wonderful couch and a beautiful home. And she understood that the couch was a mother's, where you sit with your kids and you have the family. And so I have my couch, and you have my miracle couch.
Well, and you have a book about all the miracles.
That's my next book coming.
Yeah, that's coming. All right. Last question. Why do we incarnate?
Oh, because we love each other so much. There's not enough time for love when you fall in love. And I'm not just talking about romantic love. Like, I made friends. I've got a good friend in my rosary circle. She's an 89-year-old woman who's shown up from California, who can't believe she discovered us, and she comes to pray the rosary. And she's like my long-lost soul sister, right? And I just think like, oh, I hope next time around we get to be friends who live next door to each other, And I like you. I don't get to see you very often. And I think, oh my gosh, I would love to be like, sisters with Julie in my next life. Think about the mischief we'd get into.
Oh, I know. I know. We'd have to alert the authorities.
My favorite movie about reincarnation is Groundhog Day, because we think that we don't want to be, Bill Murray in that movie doesn't want to be reborn. He doesn't want to wake up to the same town in the same day. But eventually he falls in love with where he is.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. You are so extraordinary. You are one of my favorite people on the planet. And I love Clark too, as you know.
This is
And so I just can't say enough good things about you. Everybody watch this episode. Obviously, you're watching it if you've come to this end, but then watch our other 2 interviews. We're gonna put them in the show notes
Sure.
because Clark's on the first one, and he's just as charming as you are fabulous, and I love the story of how you met. And then in the second one, we talk about ancestral healing and things like that. And I find that when I'm with you, whether it's on Zoom or in person, that there's just so much to talk about with you that we just can go on and on and on. So
Well, I am so
thank you.
grateful for the work you're doing in the world, Julie. I just think you are you're just such a force of goodness and love and joy in the world, and you bring so much faith to people. I thank you from the bottom of my soul.
Oh, well, thank you for those sweet words. How can people learn more about you and your work?
Takebackthemagic.com. That's my website. And there you'll find out what I'm up to about all my books and the workshops I teach. If you want to learn more about praying the rosary, wayoftherose.org.
And you have a Substack because I
Yeah, I
belong to it.
do. And that's also called Take Back the Magic. And Way of the Rose, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, and we're even going to be on Substack in the next month. We're all over the place. You can find us, and we're not standoffish. So come pray the rosary with us.
No, 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 no. You're like a warm hug. Yeah. All right, everybody. Lots, lots to think about here. We've raised all kinds of different conversation lines in our time together. In the meantime, sending you lots of love from Sweet Home, Alabama. Mwah! And from New York, too, where Perdita is. We'll see you next time. Bye, everybody. To enhance your spiritual journey, click on one of the videos below and remember to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this episode with your family and friends.